For most families, building a billion-dollar empire is a dream. For the Busch family, the creators of Budweiser, it became a curse passed down through generations, paid for not in money but in blood, sweat, and tears. This is the story of how the king of beers spawned a dynasty haunted by depression, addiction, and premature death, proving that some fortunes come at a price that is far too high to pay. To understand the origins of this curse, we have to travel back in time to the rough and tumble world of mid-19th century St. Louis, Missouri. Today, it's just another city in the American Midwest. But back then, St. Louis was a frontier boomtown. It was the gateway to the West, a vibrant, chaotic, and rapidly expanding hub on the banks of the mighty Mississippi River, teeming with German immigrants who brought with them a deep-rooted, almost sacred love for good beer. In the 1850s and 60s, America was a nation of whiskey and cider drinkers. Beer was still a relatively niche beverage, often a heavy, dark English-style ale, but the Germans brought with them their taste for lager, a lighter, crisper, more refreshing style of beer. All across the Midwest, small breweries, often little more than a family operation in a basement, began to spring up to cater to this growing community. But brewing was an incredibly difficult and precarious business. This was an era before refrigeration was commonplace, before the science of pasteurization was understood. A batch of beer could be ruined by a single stray bacterium. A sudden heat wave could spoil an entire inventory. Beer couldn't travel. It had to be brewed and consumed locally, usually within a few blocks of the brewery itself. The idea of a national brand of beer was not just impractical, it was technologically impossible, a fantasy. But it was in this challenging, limited world that a young, ambitious German immigrant with a vision that stretched far beyond the city limits of St. Louis would arrive and change everything. His name was Adolphus Busch. Adolphus Busch, the man who would become the undisputed king of American beer, was not born into a brewing family. He was born in 1839 in what is now Germany, the second youngest of a staggering 21 children. His father was a prosperous wholesaler of wine and brewery supplies. From a young age, Adolphus was surrounded by the hustle of commerce, but he had no intention of living in the shadow of his father or his many siblings. He was possessed by a relentless, almost manic energy and a burning desire to make a name for himself. At the age of just 18, in 1857, he left his home and joined his brothers in St. Louis. He didn't start as a brewer. He started, like his father, as a supplier. He quickly established a successful business, the Wattenberg and Busch Company, selling supplies to the dozens of small breweries that dotted the city. This gave him an invaluable ground-level view of the entire industry. He saw their struggles, their inefficiencies, and their limitations. He was a born salesman, a natural showman with a charismatic, magnetic personality. He was a large, imposing man who loved to dress in fine clothes, a stark contrast to the rough, working-class brewers he did business with. But his greatest asset was his mind. He was a visionary, a man who saw not just the present state of the industry, but its immense, untapped potential. He understood that the future of beer was not in being a better brewer, but in mastering science, technology, and marketing on a national scale. His grand ambition, however, would find its footing not through his own venture, but through a shrewd and fateful marriage. In 1861, he married Elisa, known as Lily Anheuser. Lily was the daughter of a man named Eberhard Anheuser. Anheuser was not a brewer by trade. He was a successful soap and candle manufacturer. He had, almost by accident, acquired a small, constantly failing brewery in 1860 to cover a loan that had gone bad. The Bavarian Brewery, as it was called, was a financial disaster. Anheuser knew nothing about making beer and was on the verge of shutting it down. But his new son-in-law, the energetic and brilliant Adolphus Busch, saw the struggling brewery not as a liability, but as the opportunity of a lifetime. He joined his father-in-law's company, and within a few years, through sheer force of will, he had completely taken it over. He renamed it Anheuser-Busch. The partnership was a study in contrasts. Anheuser was the quiet, cautious financier, while Busch was the flamboyant, risk-taking operator. It was Busch's vision that transformed the company. He began to experiment, to innovate, to break all the old rules of brewing. His first revolutionary move was a direct assault on the problem of spoilage and distance. He was one of the very first brewers in America to embrace the new, controversial science of pasteurization, a process developed by Louis Pasteur in France. By heating the beer to kill off the microorganisms that caused it to spoil, he could dramatically extend its shelf life. This was a game changer. It meant that his beer could survive long journeys, breaking the chains of local distribution. But pasteurization was only half the battle. To truly build a national brand, he needed a way to keep the beer cold on its long journey across the vast American landscape. So, he built a fleet of refrigerated rail cars, an innovation that was as important to the beer industry as the internet would later be to communication. He established a network of ice houses along the railway lines, creating the first national cold chain. Suddenly, a man in dusty Texas or sunny California could enjoy a cold, refreshing beer brewed hundreds of miles away in St. Louis. With the technology in place, he needed the perfect product. He found it in a new recipe developed by his friend Carl Conrad. It was a lighter, crisper, more effervescent lager, made with rice in addition to the traditional barley malt. It was designed to appeal to a broader American palate, a deliberate move away from the heavier, more bitter German-style beers. In 1876, the year of the American centennial, he launched this new beer. He called it Budweiser. The name itself was a stroke of marketing genius and a source of immense controversy. He borrowed it from the famous brewing town of Budweis in Bohemia, now the Czech Republic, claiming his beer was made in the Budweiser style. This act of appropriation would launch a legal battle with European brewers that would last for over 100 years, a fight that, in many ways, only served to increase the brand's fame. Adolphus Busch was a marketing machine. He was one of the first American industrialists to understand the power of branding. He created a visual identity for his product that was instantly recognizable. He gave away thousands of promotional items, from calendars and posters to pocket knives and corkscrews, all emblazoned with the Anheuser-Busch logo. And in the 1880s, he introduced the iconic team of Clydesdale horses, using them to pull the beer wagons in parades and public events. The massive, powerful, yet gentle horses became a living symbol of the brand's strength, quality, and traditional values. By the time of his death in 1913, Adolphus Busch had transformed a small, failing local brewery into the largest and most successful brewing company in the world. He was a titan of the Gilded Age, a self-made man who had built an unparalleled industrial empire. He left behind a vast fortune and an even larger legacy, and he expected his children to carry it on with the same relentless drive. The heavy crown now passed to his eldest son, August A. Busch Sr. August Sr. was, in many ways, his father's son. He was a commanding authoritarian figure, fiercely intelligent and utterly devoted to the family business. He had been groomed from birth to take over, and he did so with a deep sense of duty. But while his father had been the visionary builder, August Sr.'s role was to be the steadfast protector of the empire, and he would face a challenge that even his brilliant father had never imagined: prohibition. The passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920, outlawing the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, was a death sentence for the American brewing industry. Hundreds of breweries across the country shut their doors forever, but August A. Busch Sr. refused to surrender. In a remarkable display of business ingenuity and foresight, he pivoted the entire Anheuser-Busch operation. He converted his massive breweries into factories that produced a dizzying array of new non-alcoholic products. They made ice cream, soft drinks, corn syrup, and baker's yeast. They even manufactured motorized truck bodies. Their most famous product during this era was a non-alcoholic malt beverage called Bevo, which became incredibly popular for a time. This strategy was a stroke of genius. It not only kept the company financially solvent during the 13 long years of Prohibition, but it also kept the Anheuser-Busch name in the public consciousness, and crucially, kept the company's vast infrastructure and skilled workforce intact. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, Anheuser-Busch was ready. While its competitors were scrambling to rebuild, the Busch breweries roared back to life almost overnight. The end of Prohibition was a moment of national jubilation, and August Sr. seized it. He arranged for a celebratory case of Budweiser to be delivered to President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House by the iconic Clydesdale hitch, a masterful piece of public relations that cemented Budweiser's status as America's national beer. It was the crowning achievement of his career, a moment of ultimate triumph after a long and arduous battle. But the victory was tragically short-lived. The immense pressure of steering the family empire through the crisis of Prohibition, combined with the constant burden of living up to his father's colossal legacy, had taken a deep and unseen toll on August Sr. He was known to be a heavy drinker, a habit that was perhaps both a product of his industry and a coping mechanism for his immense stress. He suffered from depression, a private struggle that was completely hidden from the public eye. In March of 1934, just over a year after the triumphant repeal of Prohibition, August A. Busch Sr., at the age of 68, took a revolver and ended his own life at the family's magnificent country estate, Grant's Farm. To protect the family's image and the wholesome brand they had so carefully cultivated, the cause of death was officially reported as heart failure. But the truth was a devastating secret, a tragic and violent act that marked the first sign of a dark undercurrent running beneath the surface of the family's glittering success. The king was dead, and the curse of the Busch dynasty had tragically begun to reveal itself. The family's dark secret was now sealed, buried behind a facade of corporate respectability. With the dutiful patriarch gone, the immense weight of the Busch empire and its profound pressures now fell to the third generation. The man who would step into the spotlight was a figure unlike any the family had ever seen, a flamboyant showman who would embrace the celebrity of being a Busch and turn the brand into a global symbol of the American good life, all while the shadows of his father's tragedy lengthened. The new king was August A.T. Gussie Busch Jr. Where his father, August Sr., had been a stern, dutiful, and intensely private captain of industry, Gussie was a flamboyant, larger-than-life showman. He was a born promoter, a man who loved the spotlight, a charismatic rogue with a booming voice and an even bigger personality. He was less interested in the day-to-day grind of the brewery than he was in the grand performance of being a Busch. He saw the company not just as a business but as a stage, and he was its undisputed star. He had a passion for life that was infectious and an appetite for indulgence that was legendary. Gussie embodied the brand he was selling: loud, fun, and unapologetically American. He took the reins of Anheuser-Busch in 1946 after his older brother, Adolphus Busch III, who had briefly served as CEO, died. Gussie's era would be the one that truly cemented Budweiser as the king of beers and an inseparable part of American culture. He understood, perhaps even better than his visionary grandfather, the power of marketing. He poured millions into advertising, sponsoring everything from local bowling leagues to national television programs. He was one of the first to grasp the immense potential of the new medium of television, using it to beam the Budweiser message of good times and good fellowship directly into the living rooms of the burgeoning post-war middle class. The famous This Bud's For You campaign, launched in the 1970s, was a masterpiece of marketing celebrating the everyday working-class American and making Budweiser their beer of choice. Gussie's two great passions, outside of his family and his company, were his beloved Clydesdale horses and the game of baseball. He elevated the Clydesdales from a clever marketing tool into national icons. He built the magnificent cathedral-like stables at the family's estate, Grant's Farm, which he opened to the public, turning it into a major tourist attraction. But his most famous and beloved act was his purchase of the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team in 1953. The team was on the verge of being sold and moved out of town, a devastating prospect for the city. Gussie stepped in, not just as a businessman, but as a civic savior. He bought the team, ensuring they would stay in St. Louis. He renamed their stadium Busch Stadium and used the games as a massive season-long promotional vehicle for his beer. He was a hands-on owner, a constant presence at the ballpark, a man who clearly and deeply loved the team. For the people of St. Louis, he wasn't just a wealthy brewer. He was one of them, a fan, a patriarch of the city itself. His personal life was as flamboyant as his business style. He was married 4 times and had a total of 10 children. His primary residence was a magnificent estate called Grant's Farm, a sprawling 281-acre property that had once been owned by President Ulysses S. Grant. Gussie transformed it into his own personal paradise, complete with a private zoo filled with exotic animals, which he would often show off to a parade of celebrity guests from movie stars to presidents. Another of his homes, a mansion in St. Petersburg, Florida, was renowned for its wild parties and its own menagerie of animals. There's a famous and likely true story of Gussie riding one of his elephants, Tessie, in a local parade simply because he could. He lived life on a grand scale, a boisterous, beer-loving baron who seemed to be having the time of his life. But behind the curtain of this constant performance, the familiar pressures of the Busch legacy were beginning to fester. Gussie, for all his showmanship, was also a shrewd and demanding businessman who expected his children to fall in line. And it was his relationship with his eldest son, August A. Busch III, that would define the next chapter of the dynasty in a brutal and deeply personal power struggle. August A. Busch III, known in family circles as Three Sticks, was the polar opposite of his father. Where Gussie was the gregarious showman, August III was a cold, calculating, and intensely private workaholic. He was a scholar of beer, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the singular pursuit of mastering the family business. He started at the bottom, working in every department of the brewery, from the malt house to the bottling line. He was a brilliant student of the industry, a master of logistics, finance, and marketing. He was also fiercely ambitious and deeply resentful of his father's flamboyant, often erratic management style. He saw his father's focus on the Cardinals and his celebrity lifestyle as a dangerous distraction from the core business of selling beer. He believed the company needed a more disciplined, more professional, and more ruthless leader to navigate the increasingly competitive beer market. The tension between father and son simmered for years before finally boiling over in the mid-1970s. August III, having quietly consolidated his power and built alliances on the company's board of directors, staged a boardroom coup. He forced his own father out of the CEO position, effectively seizing control of the empire. The act was a shocking betrayal that created a deep and painful rift between them. Gussie, the patriarch who had ruled for decades, was publicly humiliated. He famously told a reporter, "I thought I brought him up better than that." The father and son would remain estranged for many years. It was a cold, clinical, and brutal transfer of power, a clear sign that for the new generation, the business of beer came before the bonds of family. Under the iron-fisted rule of August III, Anheuser-Busch entered a new era of dominance. He was a relentless and brilliant CEO. He declared war on his competitors, particularly the Miller Brewing Company, which had been gaining market share with its Miller Lite. August III responded by launching Bud Light in 1982, a product that would go on to become the best-selling beer in America. He was a micromanager of legendary intensity. Stories from within the company painted a picture of a man obsessed with every detail, from the precise hopping rate of the beer to the font on the packaging. He was feared and respected in equal measure. He demanded absolute perfection and unwavering loyalty from his executives. He continued the company's marketing dominance, creating iconic advertising campaigns like the Budweiser Frogs and the What's Up commercials that became global cultural phenomena. By the time he retired in 2002, Anheuser-Busch controlled over 50% of the American beer market. He had taken his father's company and turned it into an unassailable fortress. But this singular focus on the business came at a cost. August III was an intensely private, almost reclusive figure. The company, under his leadership, became more insular, and the next generation of Bushes, the children of Gussie's 10 children, were growing up in a world that was vastly different from that of their parents and grandparents. They were the heirs to an established, almost unimaginable fortune. They were no longer the scrappy, ambitious builders of an empire. They were its custodians, born into a life of absolute privilege and suffocating expectation. The patriarch of this sprawling fourth generation was Gussie's son from his first marriage, August A. Busch IV, known as August IV or the Fourth. He was in many ways a throwback to his charismatic grandfather, Gussie. He was handsome, charming, and media savvy. But his life was also marked by a series of personal tragedies and controversies that seemed to haunt him. In 1983, while a university student in Arizona, he was involved in a car accident that resulted in the death of his passenger, a young woman named Michelle Frederick. He was found by police hours later at his home, and due to the delay, no blood alcohol tests could be reliably performed. No charges were ever filed, but the incident cast a long shadow over his reputation. Despite this, he followed his father into the family business, working his way up through the marketing department. He was the creative force behind many of the company's most successful advertising campaigns in the 1990s and 2000s. And he had his grandfather's flair for promotion and a modern understanding of how to connect with a younger generation of beer drinkers. When his father, August III, retired as CEO in 2002, there was a brief period where an outsider ran the company. But the pull of the dynasty was strong, and in 2006, August IV was named CEO, the fifth, and, as it would turn out, the final member of the Busch family to lead the company. His tenure at the top was to be short and turbulent. He inherited a company that, while still dominant, was facing new challenges. The rise of craft beer was beginning to chip away at the dominance of the big brewers, and the company's stock price had stagnated. But the greatest threat was not internal, it was external. In 2008, a hostile takeover bid was launched by the massive Belgian-Brazilian brewing conglomerate InBev. The takeover bid created a bitter and devastating schism within the Busch family. The family at this point was a sprawling clan of dozens of cousins, aunts, and uncles, many of whom had little to do with the day-to-day running of the business. Their primary connection to the empire was their massive stock holdings. InBev's offer was incredibly generous, promising to make the already wealthy family members astronomically richer. For many of them, the choice was a simple financial calculation. They saw a chance to cash out at the top of the market and secure their individual fortunes forever. But for others, including August IV and his uncle, Adolphus Busch IV, the idea of selling the company was an act of profound betrayal. It was a surrender of their family's 150-year-old legacy. They saw it as selling their birthright, an insult to the memory of their ancestors who had built the company from nothing. A bitter public battle erupted. The family was split into warring factions. August IV fought desperately to keep the company independent, searching for a white knight investor and launching a public relations campaign to rally support. But the financial logic of the InBev offer was overwhelming. The board of directors, obligated to its shareholders, ultimately accepted the deal. In a stunning multi-billion-dollar transaction, Anheuser-Busch was sold to InBev for $52 billion. For the first time since the Civil War, the company that bore their name was no longer controlled by the Busch family. The king of beers had been conquered by foreign invaders. It was the end of an American corporate dynasty. The sale left deep and lasting scars on the family. There were accusations of betrayal, of greed, of a younger generation squandering the legacy of their forefathers. The family, which had survived Prohibition and the Great Depression, had ultimately been brought down, not by a market collapse, but by a combination of internal division and the irresistible forces of global capitalism. The great fortress that August III had built had been sold from within, and as the family members cashed their billion-dollar checks, the tragedies that had been lurking in the shadows of their private lives began to emerge into the harsh, unforgiving light. The deal was done. The checks were cashed, turning the Busch clan into unimaginably wealthy exiles from their own kingdom. But this sudden influx of billions, combined with the profound loss of their collective identity, proved to be a toxic, and for some, a fatal combination. The family's purpose had been amputated, leaving a void. The dark undercurrent of tragedy that had whispered through the family for decades was about to become a deafening roar, starting with the last king himself, August A. Busch IV. For generations, the family's name had been inextricably linked to their work. They were brewers. They were marketers. They were the kings of a global empire. Their identity was forged in the heat of the brew kettles, in the thunder of the Clydesdales' hooves, in the roar of the crowd at Busch Stadium. The company was not just a source of wealth. It was their purpose, their religion, their reason for being. The sale for many felt like an amputation. They were suddenly unmoored, cast adrift on a sea of limitless wealth with no kingdom to rule, no legacy to build upon, only one to spend. This loss of purpose, combined with the sudden influx of almost incomprehensible riches, would prove to be a toxic, and for some, a fatal combination. The dark undercurrent of tragedy that had been whispering through the family for decades was about to become a deafening roar. At the center of this new post-empire world was August A. Busch IV, the last king in exile. He had fought and lost the battle for his family's company, and the defeat seemed to leave him a man adrift. He retreated from the public eye, living a more reclusive life in his sprawling St. Louis mansion. But the glare of the spotlight would find him again in the most tragic way imaginable. In December of 2010, his 27-year-old girlfriend, a model and aspiring waitress named Adrienne Martin, was found dead in his home. The cause of death was an accidental overdose of oxycodone. The investigation that followed was a media firestorm. It pulled back the curtain on a world of immense privilege and its dark, hedonistic underbelly. Martin, it was revealed, had struggled with her own personal issues, including a painful custody battle for her young son. The toxicology report showed a level of oxycodone in her system that was many times the therapeutic dose. While August the 4th was not charged with any crime, prosecutors determined they could not prove he had supplied the fatal dose. The details that emerged were deeply unsettling. He had delayed calling for help for hours after finding her unresponsive, instead making calls to his personal assistant and security guard. When the paramedics finally arrived, it was far too late. The incident culminated in a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Martin's ex-husband on behalf of her son, which August the 4th eventually settled for $1.75 million. The tragedy was a stark, heartbreaking illustration of a world where immense wealth and power could not prevent a senseless loss of life. For the public, it painted a picture of a fallen king, isolated in his mansion, surrounded by the tragic consequences of a life lived without guardrails. This image of a man unmoored was tragically reinforced in 2017. Police in Swansea, Illinois, received a bizarre call about a helicopter that had landed in a nearby office park. When they arrived, they found August the 4th at the controls. He appeared to be intoxicated, struggling to take off. Inside the helicopter, police found a cocktail of prescription pills and several loaded firearms. He would later claim he had simply had a reaction to a mixture of fertility medication and anxiety pills. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident was another humiliating public spectacle, a sad chapter in the life of a man who seemed to be grappling with the loss of his corporate kingdom. But the tragedies surrounding August the 4th were not isolated incidents. They were part of a far more disturbing and heartbreaking pattern that seemed to stalk the younger generations of the Busch family, a phenomenon that some have come to call the inheritance curse. This was a generation born with everything, yet seemingly possessed by a deep-seated unhappiness, a vulnerability to the siren song of addiction and self-destruction. The stories are numerous, and they are devastating. The branch of the family, headed by Peter W. Busch, one of Gussie Jr.'s sons, seemed for a time to have escaped the corporate pressures. Peter moved to Florida and embraced a life centered on his love for the outdoors, running a successful Anheuser-Busch distributorship and founding wildlife conservation charities. He and his wife Joan raised their children in this seemingly idyllic, sun-drenched world, far from the high-stakes drama of the St. Louis boardroom. But the shadows of the family's legacy were long. Their son, Stephen Busch, was a handsome and well-liked young man, but he struggled for years with addiction. In 2009, just a year after the company was sold, Stephen, at the age of 27, died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound at his family's home. His death was a private agony for his family, another young Busch life cut tragically short. An even more heartbreaking pattern of tragedy can be found in the family of Gussie's daughter, Carlotta Busch. Carlotta married a man named John Prosser, and they had 4 children. Their family life was one of immense wealth and privilege, but it was also marked by profound and repeated loss. Their eldest son, August Prosser, died in a car accident in 1976. But it was the fate of their younger son, Schuyler Prosser Busch, that seemed to echo the darkest themes of the family's history. Schuyler was a troubled young man who battled depression and substance abuse for years. In 1997, at the age of just 19, he shot himself in the family's mansion. The parallels to the suicide of his great-grandfather, August Sr., were chilling. Both men had taken their own lives with a gun in a family home, after a long and silent battle with their inner demons. The tragedies continued to mount. In 2014, Christina King, Gussie Jr.'s great-granddaughter, a young woman with a history of struggling with addiction, was found dead at the age of 29 in the family's iconic beach house in Virginia. The cause was an overdose of cocaine and alcohol. The house, a place that had been the setting for decades of happy family gatherings, had become the scene of another premature death. One by one, these stories paint a devastating portrait. This was not a curse in a supernatural sense, but a curse born of a very real and toxic set of circumstances. It was the curse of having too much money and not enough purpose. It was the curse of a family name so large it was impossible to escape its shadow or to create an identity of one's own. It was the curse of a genetic predisposition to alcoholism and depression that seemed to run through the family line, a vulnerability that was tragically amplified by a lifestyle of limitless indulgence. The very product that had created their fortune, an alcoholic beverage marketed with an image of wholesome fun, was, in a cruel twist of irony, a central player in the private destruction of their own family members. In the wake of the company's sale and these mounting personal tragedies, some members of the next generation have attempted to fight back, to reclaim their family's identity and forge a new path. Billy Busch Sr., another of Gussie's sons, has been the most public in this effort. He and his family, including his 7 children, have embraced the modern tool of celebrity, reality television. Their show, The Busch Family Brood, which aired in 2020, was a fascinating, if sometimes awkward, attempt to control their own narrative. It portrayed a boisterous, loving, and deeply competitive family, living a life of chaotic luxury on their 700 acres estate. At the center of the show was Billy's dream, to launch his own craft beer, Kräftig. The venture was more than just a business. It was a deeply personal quest. It was an attempt to get back into the game, to put the Busch name back on a beer bottle, to prove that the family's brewing legacy was not just a thing of the past. But even this attempt to forge a new future is haunted by the past. The show itself revealed the immense pressure on his own children to live up to the family name. The story of the Busches in the 21st century is one of a family grappling with the aftermath of an empire's sale and a legacy of profound human loss. They are a dynasty defined not by what they are building, but by what they have lost. The sale of the company was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of the first act. The second act, a far more personal and painful drama about the true meaning and cost of their inheritance, is still being played out, one tragic headline at a time. These heartbreaking stories of addiction and loss are the human cost of a dynastic dream. The sale of the company was not the end of the story. It was the end of the first act. To truly understand the legacy of the Busch family, we must now look beyond the individual tragedies and ask a more profound question. What does this epic saga tell us about the nature of wealth, the weight of inheritance, and the often bitter reality of the American dream? The saga of the Busch family is one of the most compelling and tragic cautionary tales in the annals of American enterprise. It serves as a stark illustration of the double-edged sword of inheritance. The very qualities that forged the dynasty, the relentless, all-consuming ambition of Adolphus Busch, the fierce devotion to the family brand, and the sheer scale of the wealth they accumulated, became the very forces that tormented and, in some cases, destroyed his descendants. The empire was built to last forever, a fortress of finance and industry, but it was a fortress that offered no protection from the most insidious of enemies, the ones that lurked within. One of the most profound themes is the crushing psychological burden of a famous name. To be born a Busch in the 20th century was to be born into a life not your own. It was to live in the shadow of giants, to be constantly measured against the near mythical achievements of your ancestors. Adolphus Busch wasn't just a grandfather, he was a titan of the Gilded Age, a visionary who had built a global empire with his bare hands. August A. Busch Sr. had saved that empire from the existential threat of prohibition. Gussie Busch Jr. was a beloved civic icon, a king in his own city. For the generations that followed, the path was not one of creation, but of preservation. Their primary duty was not to build something new, but simply not to squander what had already been built. This lack of a personal frontier, of a mountain of one's own to climb, can create a profound sense of purposelessness, a void that is all too easily filled with the temporary comforts of alcohol, drugs, and reckless behavior. This leads to the most painful aspect of their legacy, the problem of wealth without purpose. The early Bushes were defined by their work. Their ambition was channeled into the ferocious, all-consuming task of building and running the largest brewery in the world. But for the fourth and fifth generations, the work was already done. They were born into a world where every material need and want was met before it was even expressed. This phenomenon, sometimes glibly referred to as affluenza, is a very real and corrosive force. When you have unlimited resources but no compelling reason to get out of bed in the morning, the pursuit of pleasure can quickly morph into a descent into hedonism and self-destruction. The tragic deaths of Stephen Busch, Schuyler Prosser Busch, Adrian Martin, and Christina King are not just isolated incidents. They are data points in a heartbreaking pattern, a testament to the fact that money, in the absence of meaning, can become a poison. In this way, the Busch family saga is a tragic inversion of the American dream. The story begins with the quintessential narrative. A poor immigrant arrives in America, and through hard work, ingenuity, and a bit of luck, he builds a fortune and a dynasty that will last for generations. It is a story of upward mobility, of creating something from nothing. But for the later generations of the Busch family, the story became one of a struggle against the suffocating inertia of what had already been created. Theirs was not a battle against poverty, but a battle against privilege. It is a stark reminder that while the journey to the top of the mountain can be exhilarating and life-affirming, being born at the summit can be a profoundly disorienting and dangerous experience.